Hello everyone and good evening. My name's Don Arleth and welcome to our main edition of World News Tonight here on TVP World. Since he can't travel the world leaders are coming to him. This year, Vladimir Putin is hosting the annual BRICS summit. The fact that the Russian president has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes is not stopping the leaders of China, India, and South Africa from attending, among others. We'll have that in just a bit, but first up, let's take a look at tonight's headlines. Leaders of Hungary, Serbia, and Slovakia propose setting up migrant hotspots. Poland will be closing the Russian consulate in the western city of Poznań. And Yulia Navalny, widow of opposition leader, intends to become president of Russia. Brussels' migration pact is part of the problem, not the solution, according to the leaders of Hungary, Slovakia, and Serbia. These Eastern European countries met today and are vowing to continue the battle against illegal migration as the issue takes on a greater role in Europe. Here's Aaron Dahmen and his report.
Smiles, hugs and handshakes in the middle of a political migration storm. In Komárno, on the Slovak-Hungarian border, Hungarian and Slovakian Prime Ministers Viktor Orbán and Robert Fico gathering with Serbian President Alexander Vučić to discuss an issue sitting at the top of the region's agenda.
I am certain that the principle we have to follow is that only those people can enter the European Union whose asylum case has already been decided.
All three leaders have spoken out against migration, and it wasn't long before they announced strict new measures they want adopted by the European Union.
We are talking about building camps in migrants' countries of origin or in safe third countries where migrants will be intercepted.
The idea is similar to others that have gained traction in recent weeks. Italy is already working with Albania to have asylum requests processed there, and even EU President Ursula von der Leyen has indicated that so-called return hubs for rejected asylum seekers have been discussed in Brussels. But President Vučić made it clear that his country, which is not yet part of the EU, would refuse to become a hotspot.
It has never crossed my mind, and I would not accept Serbia becoming a hotspot under any circumstances. There are no such tricks and such games, and no discussions.
When it comes to shutting asylum seekers out, including those coming into Poland, one expert is worried about the flow-on effects.
We have to be very careful not to open a Pandora's box, because of course, once we reject the right for asylum, we are entering a new phase of the development since World War II.
It all comes as President Vučić himself is gearing up to welcome Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk to Belgrade this week, as Serbia, a historically staunch ally of Russia, continues to show a keen interest in joining the European Union. Prime Minister Donald Tusk faced backlash for his hardline plan to temporarily ban asylum seekers, but very quickly he charmed Brussels and got EU leaders on the same page. So charmer or hardliner? We'll see this week which tactic he deploys in Belgrade. From Warsaw for TVP World, I'm Aaron Dahmen.
China-EU relations under the microscope. In Strasbourg today, members of the European Parliament debated China's increasing military provocations near Taiwan, which have strained EU-China relations. Rising trade tensions are adding to the pressure, exposing divisions within the bloc as it struggles to balance economic ties with Beijing and security concerns. Our EU Affairs correspondent Sasha Farbach has more.
The European Union and China, two players that share a massive amount of bilateral trade, still well over 725 billion euros in the past year alone. But that relationship is changing as we see of more aggression and more aggressive policies by Beijing, particularly when it comes to trade, but also when it comes to the island nation of Taiwan. Now, this is exactly what MEPs are discussing here on taking a stronger line against Beijing, criticizing its military provocations. In fact, there are warnings by MEPs against China.
Now is the time to bring our money back from the China. Also, we invest there a lot of money. If China wants to have it aggressive policy against the Taiwan, then it's time to stop our investment and time to stop bring the goods from the Chinese companies. I think that we have to send it very strong signal and to say China, if you will continue with this provocation, we will stop the relationship, so open relationship like with you. We are not naive as we were with Russia.
Now, severing economic ties is extreme, but it is something that is being echoed here by certain MEPs. But certainly there are also criticisms leveled against the European Parliament itself for being too slow when seeing the threat of China.
Yes, we should. I think the European Parliament has always been late when it comes to these authoritarian regimes and how to react to them. Russia was the alarming example, but China is the next one to follow, and we are already late with China. I think we should be way tougher with China.
At the core of this very much was a UN resolution, which was number 2758, which in 1971 recognized the People's Republic of China as the only legitimate representative of China to the United Nations. Now, this is something that has prevented Taiwan from getting a lot of access to the United Nations. It's certainly something that now is in discussions here, that more needs to be done to stand up for values, for democracy. Now, if this will lead to changing policy, will be another question, as capitals here from Berlin to Paris do have their own policy when it comes to closer ties and trade relations with Beijing. Time will tell if this resolution here passed in the European Parliament, if it does pass on Thursday, will be enough to sway those opinions. But certainly the BRICS summit happening in Kazan will take note of the European parliamentarians here discussing a stronger stance against China. That's Sasha Farbach for TVP World in Strasbourg.
Following reports of several sabotage attempts allegedly carried out in Poland by Russian actors, the government in Warsaw has decided to strike back at the Kremlin using diplomatic means. This blow will see the Russian consulate in Poznań closed.
Serhii S., a Ukrainian national detained in January of 2024, recently told the Polish prosecution that he was tasked with setting fire to a paint factory near Wrocław, Poland by Russian intelligence. He is one of several people the police detained earlier this year that are suspected of attempting to sabotage several facilities and installations across Poland and Europe. This was all the confirmation the Polish government needed to start taking steps against Russian influence on Polish soil.
As the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I have access to reports showing that the attempted acts of sabotage, both in Poland and in other countries, are organized by the Russian Federation. In light of that, I decided to revoke the Russian consulate in Poznań's permission to operate. Its staff will be regarded persona non grata in Poland.
Experts and analysts believe that some of the fires that broke out in Poland over the course of last year could also have been orchestrated by Russian intelligence. No specific cases have been confirmed as of yet. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova responded to the allegations, promising a painful response to Poland.
Leaders of BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa will discuss the future of the bloc over the course of the next few days at their annual summit in Russia. Besides the obvious anti-Western talking points, Russia's main objective at the summit is to prove one thing: that despite Western sanctions and scrutiny, Russia is not alone. Franciszek Pils reports.
One after another, some of the most powerful figures in the world came off their planes and onto the tarmac in Kazan, Russia. Given that the BRICS countries make up around 45% of the world's population, most leaders of the bloc decided to show up for this grand occasion. Most is not all, however. This year, the BRICS summit will be missing its initial B, as Brazil's president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, decided to stay home following a medical incident. Despite a legitimate reason behind his non-attendance, Lula's absence perfectly sets the tone for this year's BRICS summit. Discord among member states when compared to rival blocs.
In terms of the GDP, it is roughly similar to the G7, But what is lacking in this BRICS club is a common sort of idea, a common sort of civilizational ground.
Perhaps the most outrageous name rumored to be on the attendance list is that of Antonio Guterres. The United Nations Secretary General, who has not been to Russia since April 2022, has gone on record multiple times denouncing Moscow's savage invasion of Ukraine. So seeing reports of his trip to Russia from multiple media outlets drove Kyiv into a frenzy.
The UN Secretary-General declined Ukraine's invitation to the first Global Peace Summit in Switzerland. He did, however, accept the invitation to Kazan from war criminal Putin. This is a wrong choice that does not advance the cause of peace. It only damages the UN's reputation.
TVP World reached out to the UN Press and Media Office for an official statement on whether Mr. Guterres will be attending the summit. So far, however, there has not been any confirmation from the United Nations on this matter. According to analysts such as Jim O'Neill, the former chief economist of Goldman Sachs and the man behind the BRICS acronym, getting BRICS members to agree on a common approach is, quote, bonkers. Analysts say this puts the Kremlin in an uncomfortable situation, as it is actively looking for allies on the international stage following its falling out with the wider West over a particular, quote-unquote, special military operation. While internally the bloc is far from unified, the attendance of India, China, South Africa, Egypt and more makes analysts believe that Russia is indeed not alone.
Symbolically, this is certainly a very bad day, I would say, for humanity, because it sort of justifies this kind of behavior by the very fact that this summit is taking place and that so many countries are taking part in it.
Over the course of the next few days, Vladimir Putin will have his work cut out for him as he tries to prove to both the international community and the Russian population that Moscow does not stand alone, whether it's indeed the case or not.
According to his wife, he was tortured and killed by the Kremlin. In the prison where Alexei Navalny was serving his sentence, the staff created unlawful and unbearable conditions for the Russian opposition leader. Now, documents confirming such horrible treatment of Navalny have been revealed by the independent media outlet Meduza. Pavel Chaskovsky has more.
Censoring and controlling all communication, denying proper medical care, hindering contact with lawyers or forging documentation to cover up the mistreatment. Such actions are now confirmed by hundreds of emails sent and received by Ilya Kruglishev, the head of the Regional Federal Penitentiary Service. Alexandra Shapalina, Navalny's former associate, tells me that these documents give strong evidence for the unlawful conditions of his imprisonment.
Most of this information we knew before. We knew that authorities of different levels in Russia tortured Navalny, deliberately.
Alexei Navalny, the political leader of Russian opposition and Putin's most vocal opponent, was serving a multiple-year sentence in penal colonies in the Arctic Circle for, quote, political extremism.
There should be a freedom of speech in Russia, that people who work for the government shouldn't steal the money from the government, and that everyone's rights should be protected. That was his political extremism.
Eventually, Navalny died while imprisoned in February this year. Russian authorities said Navalny suffered a sudden death syndrome, but as an attempt on his life had already been made in 2020, those close to Navalny, including his wife Yulia, claimed he was murdered.
So there are no doubt that it happened again, because he wasn't, even from prison, he was very loud and he was the strongest opponent of Vladimir Putin.
Navalny's death sparked protests around the world but left a void in the Russian opposition. Now Navalnaya herself says she intends to carry on her late husband's legacy.
If I will come back to Russia, I will participate in the elections.
As a candidate?
As a candidate.
However, she says she'll do it when Vladimir Putin is no longer in power, but he's been keeping a tight grip on Russia for more than 2 decades now and, according to the Russian constitution, can legally stay in office until 2036.
Moldovans are still contemplating the results of the EU referendum and presidential vote. Chisinau's accession into the EU will be added to the constitution as the country's strategic goal after a slim margin victory for the pro-EU camp. Our correspondent Marek Steele is in Chisinau and has been following the events there. Marek, what are the reactions as of now?
Good evening, Don. Well, people here in Chisinau seem to understand what a slim victory this was for the pro-EU camp. Here in Moldova, 50.5% of those who took part in the referendum voted for adding EU membership as a strategic goal to Moldova's constitution. But what's more interesting is that 49.5% of those who took part voted against. The EU referendum was accompanied by a presidential vote. There, Maia Sandu, the pro-European incumbent president, did not secure an outright majority of more than 50% of the vote. She secured 42%, and she will stand off with Alexander Stoyanolu, a representative of the Socialist pro-Russian party, who received 26% of the vote, much more than had been anticipated. The government here in Chisinau has been reporting of election interference, and this including paying people to vote in a certain way by perhaps people connected to Russia, but also by busing people into polling stations, and that also reportedly took place in Russia. The residents of Chisinau that I spoke to, well, are hopeful that a pro-EU path for Moldova could be maintained. They also told me what they expected from the election runoff scheduled for November 3rd. Let's take a listen.
Well, I do expect actually for the votes to be quite tight between Maia Sandu and Stoyanoglu, though I think the results might be, the winner might be the same. I expect, but I cannot be sure.
I think most of things will not change seriously. It will be like Maia Sandu will be for first place, I think.
I think it will be a win for Maia, looking about the numbers, and hopefully she will show in the future better results than the previous 4 years.
So what's next? The government here in Chisinau can now amend the constitution to add EU membership as the country's strategic goal, and this will not need a parliament approval, as the people have chosen this to be this way. And next year, Moldova will hold parliamentary elections, and this near tie for the pro-Russian camp could herald a shift of power here in Chisinau, as the pro-EU camp hasn't proved it has broad support from society. Back to you, Don.
Okay, and Marek Steele reporting there from Chisinau. Thank you for that report. Macroeconomists around the globe are focused on the International Monetary Fund's annual meeting in Washington and Tuesday morning's release of the IMF latest World Economic Outlook. Multiple top central bank officials are meeting and debating on the sidelines of the event. Konrad Gorlinski has more.
Speakers at the meeting Tuesday include, among others, ECB President Christine Lagarde, ECB Chief Economist Philip Lane, and Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey. The IMF also updated its global growth forecast on Tuesday morning. The outlook is, quote, stable yet underwhelming.
Now let me start with the good news. The battle against inflation is almost won.
Inflation is projected to continue easing and should be in line with central bank targets in most major economies by the end of 2025. Headline inflation is now projected to fall to 3.5% by the end of next year, though Argentina and Turkey should expect to remain in the double digits. In terms of GDP growth, at 3.2%, is expected to remain resilient both in 2024 and 2025, though it will be uneven among regions. India is projected to be a star, with its GDP projected to grow by 7% this year and 6.5% in the next.
Despite the good news on inflation, risks are now tilted to the downside.
Uncertainty about ongoing geopolitical tensions is still high, and further escalation could weaken sentiment. Sudden eruptions in financial market volatility could cause a retightening of financial conditions. Problems in China could generate global spillovers. And finally, rising protectionist sentiments could stifle global trade growth. In order to mitigate these risks, policymakers will need to make certain adjustments.
Implementation of
And now on a lighter note, today marks International Caps Lock Day. And online language is wildly different from our usual everyday means of communication. Emojis seem to have different meanings between generations, and writing in all caps, well, that might scare people away. Aisha Abache reports.
Did you know that this means yelling in netiquette?
It's not just caps lock use that can mean different things to different people. Emojis, for example, carry radically different meanings for younger generations than for their predecessors.
There's a few emojis that I most certainly think that are passive or aggressive, and when you look at them and see them, you just kind of feel the sense of like a different vibe between your partner.
I have a boyfriend who's older than he's older, and he's like, okay, you send me this emoji, what you are trying to say?
Smiley face. I know I have to be careful about that, especially texting to someone younger than me, but still I'm not feeling comfortable with that, and I don't know all those meanings.
Online language, or netiquette, isn't the same for everyone. While emojis can convey various meanings, nuances like these often elude older social media users.
For once, the younger generation use emoji more efficiently, as they describe more about the emotion, and it's also a way of storytelling.
What we have now is a paradoxical situation, a cultural event that typically coincides with abrupt changes such as political or technological revolutions. Notice that we're living in a time when it's not the old teaching the young, as you would expect, but the young teaching the old.
It's better to think twice before sending your next message. And be sure to explore the full range of your emoji alphabet. And of course, you might want to turn off caps lock unless you're trying to shout.
Well, the BRICS countries certainly left their caps lock on, and they're having their annual major summit in one of the biggest global events that's taken place in Russia for years. And to top it all off, it's being hosted by Vladimir Putin, who's been indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. And now joining me to discuss this gathering meant to counter Western influence is Bogdan Nahailo, editor-in-chief at the Kiev Post.
Good evening.
Good evening. Thanks for joining me. So with all these leaders attended, I think there's over 20 countries in attendance, and of course, many global leaders attending this summit. What message does this send to the West and to Ukraine?
Well, the key message is that there is an anti-Western constellation built around Russia and China, primarily, and that once upon a time, some of you will remember, there used to be a non-aligned movement in the 50s and 60s, which was manipulated largely by Russia, the Soviet Union in those days, but at least the Soviet Union kept a distance and pretended it wasn't part of this so-called non-aligned. This group actually overtly says that it is against Western influence, that it is challenging the primacy, as they see it, of Western institutions in international relations. So, it's presenting itself as a power bloc with economic and political elements in it. And of course, it's not a united front. So when you talk about Ukraine, I mean, there are different positions there. Apart from Russia, everyone is for peace. Modi, India's for peace. China wants peace, etc. But peace at what price? And peace, in whose favor? So at the end of the day, it's a kind of PR exercise. For Russia, it's important to show it that the Russians, despite sanctions and despite the war crimes, that they're not isolated. And for the others, it's good to be seen in this company, to be taken seriously, even if their countries are not particularly heavyweights on the international scene.
The president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, fell and hit his head. And he therefore sent his foreign minister to the meeting in his place. Yet we have information from the Russians that UN Secretary General Guterres is rumored to be attending. So he didn't attend the Ukraine Peace Summit, but he is attending the BRICS Summit with an indicted war criminal. How do you view this?
I'm not surprised. I was at a press conference in Lvov a year ago when Erdogan was also there from Turkey, the president, and Zelensky and Guterres. And all Guterres spoke about was about the grain corridor, about saving the world from starvation. Not one word about the suffering of the Ukrainian people, about the war crimes or anything. I was sitting in the second row. I know Guterres. I used to work with him when he was the High Commissioner for Refugees. I was very close to him then. We were on first-name basis. He knows what the world is about, and he knows what Russia represents. But for some reason, even though he's not going to be renewing his tenure, he seems afraid to actually call Russia, Putin, to account and remind them that they are a Security Council member that is grossly violating the UN Charter. So, the Kiev Post recently ran a piece by one of our authors where they said this is disgusting. Really, this is not what we expect from a UN Secretary General. You know, the traditions of Dag Hammarskjöld or other brave, courageous UN Secretary Generals seems to be forgotten.
BRICS countries make up 45% of the world's population and about a quarter of their GDP. Is this truly a threat to the West and the rules-based order?
I don't think it's a threat because, let's face it, really it amounts to several countries that have common interests. They're authoritarian states, despotic states. We're talking about Russia, China, and the rest, India, and the such-like countries are fence-sitters. The new ones that are coming are looking for economic, perhaps, advantages. And they are split amongst themselves. For example, India and China, though they are reported to have reached some agreement today or yesterday on border demarcation. But basically, they are split. For example, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is not particularly friendly with Saudi Arabia that wants to join. What is worrying, I think, is that they create a lot of noise, and the BRICS countries, and they detract attention away from the main issues. They present themselves as an alternative, shall we say, to the democratic world. And what is particularly worrying, I think, in this context is that not so much that Guterres is going, but the president of Turkey, a NATO member aligned with the West, is going to be there at this meeting, and that Turkey has requested to join.
Certainly. Well, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and ask you about Alexei Navalny's wife. She's given interviews lately. His wife, Yulia, said that she wants to run for president in Russia. Would she have a chance? Who, in your opinion, is either the best or really the true leader of the Russian opposition?
I think that's the weakness of Russia, that despite Putin being such a tyrant and Russia doing so badly in the war against Ukraine and being isolated, that there is no clear leader, there is no democratic leader that has emerged within Russia. Obviously, it's impossible because Navalny's fate, Nemtsov's fate, shows that you can't actually be publicly opposed to Putin in Russia. But even outside of Russia, there is no one clear, strong, articulate candidate. And she's very wishy-washy. Yes, there's sympathy for her because her husband was killed, but what kind of Russia does she want? What's her position on the war against Ukraine? And yes, she wants Western support, but is she prepared to denounce Russian imperialism and to say, yes, Russia will live within its boundaries and will be a law-based state? I'm not sure. You know, she and some of those that were recently released, political prisoners, they've sort of hedged their bets. You know, they want a big, strong Russia being different, but with a change of regime, you know, in their favor. But that's not particularly suitable for neighbors and for the democratic world. We want a clear position that regime change for the better, democracy, rules-based system, and abiding by the UN Charter.
Bogdan Mihailo, editor-in-chief of the Kiev Post, thank you very much for joining us tonight on World News.
My pleasure.
And that concludes this edition of World News. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time. Good night.